The question we have is an interesting one, and it has been asked at several companies, including Amazon, Booking.com, and Dandy, and a lot of other companies actually. Now, the question is a business case. Let's say if we have an e commerce website and we want to get rid of duplicate products that may be listed under different sellers, different names, or any other feature that might be different for those products, but they are listed under the same name. That's precisely what it is highlighting. For example, we have iPhone X and iPhone 10, which precisely are the same product, but you see, they are different names. How do we identify these duplicate product names? All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to yet another session, yet another mock interview by Interview Query. My name is Ravi. I am currently an engineer at a man company with over 11 years of experience, and I have dealt with different profiles in software engineering, including data engineering, backend profiles, and several other profiles. Now, here we are with another mock session, and we have Fikayo with us. Now, we are going to tackle another mock interview question, but before that, I would please request Fikayo to introduce himself.
My name, like Ravi said, is Fikayo Waliolaiton. I'm a data and analytics engineer with a little over 3 years of combined engineering, cloud infrastructure development, and analytics experience. I studied computer science while in college, and that was sort of an introduction for me into the data engineering field. For my final project, where I did a lot of data science work, and that got me interested in how data can be used in the tech space, and basically the beautiful things that can be done with data, how data is cleaned, analytics, and so on and so forth. So that was my introduction into the data science field, or the data analyst in general. I started off as a data analyst and then switched over into data engineering because I found this a lot more interesting, so to speak, because of all the necessary requirements of data pre-processing that is necessary before you move on to the analytics. So that's just a little bit about me and my background.
Thank you so much, Fikayo, for that introduction. So how about we get started with the question?
Okay. To begin, I would clarify some things. As the question clearly stated, this is a very big database and it is going to be for an e-commerce site. The questions I would like to ask to clarify. Firstly, is this a transactional database or is this an analytical database? Is this customer facing or is this basically going to be used for in-house analytics? So that's the first question. The second question is in regards to the size of the database. We said this is a very large database, but are we talking in the terabyte size or are we talking in the gigabyte size? Because that will determine if we're going to performance requirements or accuracy requirements as being most important for designing the solution for this problem. So those would be my first two questions.
So to answer your first question, I would say it's primarily an internal DB, typically where we store the product information, because that's the intention, that with an internal database, we are trying to remove that redundancy. We know that they are the same product essentially, but why do we have separate entries for them? So that's what we are trying to remove. And primarily, we are actually showing it up, the results on the actual page using the same database actually. So we need to be getting rid of those duplicate names. So I would say primarily focus or think about it from an internal perspective where we are storing the product information. That's the first question's answer. About the second question, I would say it's a big e-commerce company. So pretty much I would not quantify the size exactly, but still it's pretty huge. Like you can imagine, like not a simple small thing, but a pretty huge size of a scale of an Amazon kind of, think of it like that.
So with those two questions already set in place, if we're going to be designing for analytical database, we are going to be designing more for accuracy standards as opposed to performance requirements. But while also taking into the fact that this is going to be a database that is going to be used to display some results, we also have to take into account some performance requirements. So clearly, the first thing we have to do is to standardize and normalize data that is within the database. So for that, we're talking about the features that are going to be used to determine the duplicate entries within the database, the product name, the description of the product, the title of the product, the model name, this type of features. So we're going to have to standardize them and normalize them. So what that means is we change the case or the textual data, make sure the formats for each of the features is consistent with data within the entire feature set. And other things we can also do to standardize and normalize it is to ensure that the data sets of each of those features is homogeneous. That is, they all follow the same schema. So for the textual data are all in lowercase, and the formats for the numerical data all have the same data type. So that's to standardize and normalize the feature set. Secondly, we have to determine what feature we're going to use to determine the duplicates. So are we going to use the names of the product, the description of the product? So let's say names are different, but we have to use the model number, the description, and if there's an SKU is a unit for determining the product. So if there's an SKU, the product ID, the model number, and then the description of the product, these are the features that we can use to then compare against another product that we want to determine if it's a duplicate of the same product. Once we determine the feature set that's going to be used to compare the products that are duplicated, then we're going to use the matching algorithm, for example, a fuzzy matching algorithm, to deduplicate the entire database. So determine what features will be used for deduplicating the entire database. So like I said, what features are going to be used, like model number, the description of the product, the SKU, if it's available, the title of the product, and let's say one more, maybe the product, which is potentially different from the model number. So these are some of the features that will be used to deduplicate the dataset and compare against another product. And we standardize and normalize feature sets. So to do that, we remove trading in spaces, potentially change case for textual features, ensure the data type is consistent across each feature. So once we determine the features that we use for duplicating the database, and then we standardize and normalize the feature set, the next step is to choose an algorithm that will then be used to compare the data that we have. You can use a fuzzy matching algorithm, and the fuzzy matching algorithm will take in the feature set that has been standardized and normalized. That will be the model number, description of the product, the SKU, the title, the product ID, and so on. And then it will be used to compare against a potential output data set of those same features. And then once that is done, whatever results comes out of the fuzzy matching algorithm will then be used against the database to see if it matches the potential result that we want. So the fuzzy matching algorithm will return the matches between both the input data sets and the test and the output data set. And then the result of that will then be used to find or fine-tune the potential result of the deduplication. And then finally, once the results are known, for the next step, all the data that's coming into the database has to follow a strict schema for incoming data into the database. Strict schema rules have to be applied, and potentially a unique product identifier is assigned to each product as it comes into the database. So the reason for this is so that every time a product comes into the database and is assigned a unique ID, there's not going to be a probability of duplicates existing within the database. So once this happens and there's a strict schema that is being followed for all the incoming data, that is, for example, iPhone X and iPhone 10, or the iPhone X has to conform to the schema that is in the database. That is, an iPhone X has to be renamed to match data that is already within the database. Otherwise, it will not be accepted in the database. And that can be done through a data validation step to ensure incoming data matches data already within the database. Another thing we can do is to obtain the product information from the product manufacturer. So we can get the products, we can import third-party data from the product manufacturer. Once we have the model number, using that, we can import the specific product ID of each product using the model number and manufacturer ID, merge that in the database, and then use that to compare individual products. Once the product matches the product ID that is returned from the manufacturer, that will then be compared against another product that might have a different name. And even though it has a different name, if it has the same product ID, that will then be used to determine or deduplicate the data set.
So one of the things that you have mentioned here initially, as I see, is that each entry will have a product ID, SKU, and all those things. I mean, what if these things are not there? Let me make it a bit interesting. Like, what if I say that these fields are not there, like they are not provided with the entries? So what will be your approach in that case?
Okay, let's say none of these fields are present within the database. Then I would have to ask, what is the schema of the database? What features are available to be used for comparison with products in the database.
So I would say while there is no need to go into the exact features, but I am expecting an answer from you that what features, if this unique identifiers is not there, then what features can you think will be important for categorizing the products
Okay.
or identifying uniqueness in the products?
Okay. We can use description of the product, like I specifically mentioned. And if the unique identifier like the SKU or the product ID or the model number isn't available, then we can also use the reviews of the products. Because if it's an e-commerce site, then potentially there will be reviews of each product, which will talk about the specific product in detail. And another feature potentially be used if there are images on the e-commerce sites that identify that specific product. Use a classifier or clustering algorithm to classify the image. I don't know the specific details of how that can be done. However, I am aware of the fact that we can use a clustering algorithm to cluster together images of similar types and then also review or look at the reviews of each product and the description and use that to determine if a product is similar or comparable to another product with a different name or different seller.
So can you highlight a bit the importance of reviews and images? Like when you are looking to compare, when you're picking out these features like reviews and images, I am looking for some explanation how they will be helpful actually. Why did you pick these features actually?
So the images and the reviews are going to be helpful because like I previously said, the reviews are going to be textual data that is returned by the user or the buyer of the e-commerce site. And that will probably contain a potential identifier between that product and another product of the same type. And likewise, the images, regardless of the seller of the product, the images will probably contain uniquely identifiable product within the image. Potentially the color of the image or the size of the product within the image. And then when this is run through a classifying algorithm and clustered together, these specific features tend to exhibit or generally have the same features or they have the same values within them. So when these images or these features are clustered together, then they return similar values. And then those values can then be used to determine if it is of the same type, not necessarily the exact same, but it's of the same type, depending on the percentage score of the algorithm.
Okay. So you mentioned that, you would use these features to have an identification factor if they are similar things or not, which is fine. Let's say I accept that. But is there any human aspect to all of this? Like, let's say once you identify similar products, like, is there any human effort involved here to put the final decision there, or is it completely automated? Like, what's your approach here?
There will be an human factor. Once the algorithms have been run, obviously have to be run in an automated fashion. And then there is a score that is returned by the algorithm. It is going to be a human effort that is going to be used to determine whether result of the algorithm is going to be classified as being part of the same product or if it's a different product class. So after the algorithm has been run, human effort is going to be used to decide if the classification effort is of correct results or if it isn't. I'm not sure if you follow.
I do follow. Thanks for that. So what if I ask you that we are looking to eliminate the human effort? Like if we look to make the human effort minimal, what would be certain considerations which you will propose here if we have to look towards making it minimal? We don't want to depend on the human to take that decision for every such comparison because, again, you understand, like there might be a scale of size of Amazon would be like millions and millions of products. If you try to involve human in every decisions, that will not be optimal. So what are your thoughts here?
To eliminate the human efforts, like I already said, there's going to be a classification algorithm run in an automated fashion. And then it's a result of algorithm that's going to be done by human efforts. A potential next step is to not a classifier, however, to use a threshold. So if the result of the classification algorithm passes a specific threshold, then that can either be accepted as being of the same product type, or if it falls below a certain threshold, let's say the result of the classification algorithm gives you a value of, let's say, 90 to 95%. You can set the threshold that if the result falls or if the result falls below 95%, then that none of those products will be accepted as being of the same type. And then that moves on and then anything above 95% will be accepted as being of B type, and then the specific products that have different values or have different names can then be converted to be of the same name, and then the duplication effort will be done.
Okay. All right. So you mentioned about clustering algorithm, or we can use certain clustering algorithm. I wanted to understand a bit more on that. Say we have phones. So when you say clustering algorithm, would you just cluster them just based on, let's say, the product types, let's say mobile phones and then television separately or something like that? So what are certain things that you want to talk about, like which might be good to do? Like what kind of clustering would you highlight here?
I would potentially be talking about clustering based on, like you said, the product type and using the specific features. Like I said, classify or to cluster these products, we'll be looking at the images. And then to do that, we will have to have something like a product type to differentiate between the different products. And depending on the type of the product and also potentially let's just say for now, the product type. So we're going to use the product type to differentiate or to classify each product. And then using the product type, each product type will then be clustered together and then run through the algorithm. And then the result of that can then be used to determine if this is a phone of a specific model or if it's a phone of a specific type, and so on and so forth.
Okay. All right. Any other considerations that you want to have for this particular proposal? Like how will you scale this approach? And what are your considerations around that?
To scale the deduplication effort using the clustering algorithms, we will potentially have to run the transformation step that is the algorithm to deduplicate all of the product within the database on a cloud cluster. And then this can be divided into separate clusters. And then the result of the entire deduplication effort can then be returned into a central repository. But for the actual transformation step, we can run this on EMR. EMR is Elastic MapReduce, which is a transformation that can be used to divide transformations on multiple clusters or multiple machines so that the same transformation logic can be run on different machines. And then the result of the entire clustering effort can then be returned into a central repository. So to scale this for a really large e-commerce site, for example, Amazon, it can be run on the cloud using EMR. And then the clustering algorithm will be run in smaller pockets or smaller chunks on different clusters. And then once each step is done, result of the entire transformation logic can then be returned into the central database.
Okay. All right. Anything else that you have as part of your answer? I think while we had some discussion around this, but I would like to get through a round of feedback. But before that, if you have anything else that you want to highlight as part of this?
I would say for looking at an e-commerce site the size of Amazon, the entire deduplication effort, like I already said, will not be done in one go. And we also have to take into consideration how far back are we looking at an analytical database that has historical records as far back as necessary. We will have to basically take a sample of the entire database to run the clustering algorithm to determine what products have to be deduplicated. And then once that is done, that can be applied to the rest of the database. And while saying that, we will have to set a threshold of how far back are we going to be looking at historical records of products to deduplicate the products from. So taking it as far back as possible, we're running into an issue of performance and scale because an e-commerce site the size of Amazon is very, very large. So there will have to be some considerations made in regards to the retention policy of the data that we are deduplicating. I think that is the other thing I want to touch on.
All right. Okay. Awesome. Thank you for that. So while we went over this question and we got through certain factors, the solution and the to and fro questions that I asked you, I have some good points that I would like to discuss as part of the feedback. And before that, I would also like to get your idea, like how do you feel about this? What's your take on this question and the approach that you presented?
Looking at the question, I would say it's a very technically detailed question, in the sense that there are multiple ways or multiple levels of facets on how the problem can be solved, depending on the size of the database, depending on the feature set available. Like you said, if we do not have unique identifiers, there are different ways in which the problem can be solved or can be tackled. So for me, that was a bit of an interesting aspect to take note of when answering the question. And I would also say As regards the algorithms or the machine learning section of the question, I do not have a lot of experience. So I basically use most of the foundational knowledge I have to sort of identify and look at how to be solved. What I do know is, or what I am sure of is what the general idea of the solution of the problem, whereby the standardization, the normalization, and also the schema consideration to take, the schema facts to take into consideration to ensure that the data that is coming into the database are aligned perfectly with what is already in the database to ensure that deduplication effort does not have to continuously take place. So I think those were the different facets of the question that I found quite interesting and a little bit challenging as well.
Yeah, yep. All right. Okay, cool. Yeah, for sure, kind of is appealing towards or looking more aligned towards to explore the technical side of the things. And at the same front, something which I proposed was to look at from the scalability perspective. So the question tries to cater to these different scenarios, these different aspects of testing a candidate's knowledge. I'll come to that. But before that, I'll just try to assess how we went about this session. So I think I really like the part, and I would definitely acknowledge and appreciate the part that you took time to clarify the question. You did not jump directly onto the solution or the approach, which a lot of candidates miss. I have observed that over my experience of taking several interviews. So I would appreciate you for that. Did ask the questions, you clarified them. Just a nitpick, again, not a very important point, but keep your questions separate. That should be okay. I mean, you do not need to ask all the questions at the same time. So if you keep it separate, that should be fine with the interviewer, I would say. Certain things which you highlighted and which were done well, I would say you focused on the part of data cleaning and data pre-processing, like normalization and all those kind of stuffs that you were talking about, identifying the tokens and all. So you talked about the data pre-processing, the cleaning part, the feature extraction and all. So I like those parts that instead of going to the actual processing, actual calculation and actual implementation, you are first trying to get the right data. So that's pretty important. After that, I also like the fact that you talked about certain algorithms like fuzzy algorithm and how you would bring that into use. And I think you also highlighted about how that would be helpful given the context. So those are the good things. Towards the later section of the session, I also noticed that you were talking about, depending on the algorithm, I would have algorithm come out with certain score of each of the comparison, and then based on the score it would give it a kind of a pass or a fail kind of thing. So I think those are some good specific things to call out, and I like the explanations of this approach. And overall, as I said, you did handle certain follow-up questions also decently, and that were all the good things that you did across this session. Few things, if I can highlight, which might be good to look into from a doing better perspective. Let's say if it's an actual interview and you want to give your best, I think certain things which we can look into is that while you were explaining all these steps, all these processes that we can do this, we can do that and all, a suggestion and a very substantial thing to do can be for each of the step, for each of the processes, also carry on with an example. So for example, when you say about data processing or data pre-processing normalization, you highlighted certain fields, certain features and all there. But then, why for the later part of your process, like, okay, once I have done this normalization, then after I'll do some, this, you were talking about the algorithm part later on and the clustering part and all. So facilitate each of these steps or each of the phases of your answer with an example of that original question. Like, okay, so what this would translate with respect to this product, let's say iPhone 10, would be something like this. So if you attach an example with each of these steps, I mean, what is the input, what is the output with each step? I think that would make things much more clear, much more easier for the interviewer to follow. And I keep on saying this, that as a candidate, your job is not just to go and tell some answer there, but is to make the job of the interviewer as much as easier as possible. And giving an example would totally do that for sure. So that's one thing I will suggest. Another thing that I will suggest is from the communication aspect is that while you may try to explain, while you may try to go into the details of your answer, a lot of time, something which is observed from a communication perspective is candidates tend to go all in to their answers and just leave the interviewer out of the communication, like don't take them into the loop, which sometimes or many a times I have seen, going against you. How it does that? One of the examples is there are certain interviewers who have a laid back approach, and you do not want to do that. You do not want to have those kind of interviewers because then they will not be paying attention to your answers actually. And how can you ensure that they do not have a laid back approach? Well, periodically you can check with the interviewer. You can constantly check with them after a certain interval that, hey, is it good? Do you have any suggestions? Shall we move forward? Things like that, subtle nudges to the interviewer, which would indicate to the interviewer that, hey, I need to pay attention to the candidate because he or she is constantly coming back to me if I have any suggestions. So I should be paying attention to whatever they are saying. And that way you can avoid those laid back interviewers, actually. So that's another thing which I can suggest, that periodically just keep involving the interviewer, just check with them with these nudges which I suggested. Okay. And then talking a bit about the technicalities. So I think you mentioned a bit on the tokenization side, like from the feature extraction perspective, highlighting a bit of strategies there on the tokenization side. For example, strategies like TF-IDF strategy, which is a good way to categorize the similarity between features of two different products. So these are certain specifics that you want to talk about when you are going through phases, when you're going through stages in your answer. You want to also be talking about certain specifics like this TF-IDF to vectorize the data, or maybe strategies like n-grams. So you may want to highlight a bit on the specific side. On the scalability side, I would also suggest, while I think your answer was pretty much okay, but I would also suggest maybe to highlight the factor of having continuous data pipelines to repeatedly do these steps, whatever we discussed for each and every product as it comes into the system, so that you can minimize the manual intervention for sure, and also make it scalable. Like the fact of having data pipeline is actually something which is definitely associated with scalability. And finally, the monitoring part, I would say that you want to have a monitoring system in place which constantly monitors that how accurate, how good has been our identification algorithm, the clustering algorithm, how good it has been generating the answers or finding the similarities, and what fine tuning is needed. If, deciding on the threshold is also pretty important. That's one of the challenges, because the score which you talked about, that the algorithm gives a score and it would be compared against some threshold. So you want to have a proper threshold, like too high, too low, like there will be variations and all. So you want to be talking about these edge cases, these scenarios, the importance of this monitoring, which will be constantly feeding back to your algorithm in order to improve it further so that you can minimize the human effort there. So yeah, I think highlighting these parts would totally add a lot of value, a lot of depth to your answer. And those are some things I would suggest that we can probably look into. So overall, I think, yeah, these are some of the feedbacks which I observed. And yeah, that's all from my side. Like, do you have any questions?
I would like to ask, as the interviewer, what was your general impression about my composure as well as my ability to understand the question well before diving into the solution?
I think you understood the question well. If I assess you from the perspective that did you know how was your approach in understanding or clarifying the question, I think you understood it well. The fact that you talked about those clarifying questions and also how you started with the initial approach, I think I did not have much doubts or much things to consider that if you have understood it correctly or not. So I think from that perspective, you did well. The composure also looked fine to me. Like you were able to understand my question. You were able to give specifics with respect to each question, I would say. And all in all, I would say that, let's say, given the experience, now here is where things slightly, go into the expectation side. I mean, what is expected? So given your experience, you would mostly be looking for a mid-level, let's say mid-level engineer role. Okay. 3 years experience is what I understood, if I'm not wrong. And yeah, so that would mostly qualify you for a mid-level engineer. And while comparing from a mid-level engineer position, I would say that overall the breadth, the generic parts of your answers were mostly to the point. I would say that. However, you might have noticed that there were certain follow-ups that I asked you and certain more the related questions that I asked as follow-up question. So that should give you an indication that there are certain things which you may look into proactively. That's one thing I would suggest. When I say proactively, for example, while you gave the solution to the core problem, think about making it repeatable, like making it the scalability perspective. If you can think proactively, that would give me a very strong signal. That's one thing. I would say very super important thing as far as a mid-level engineer is concerned, but still, like having specified the platform is of Amazon's size, I think the intention was there to consider that there are a lot of products. We need to be not just thinking about like a simple approach. I'm sure you would have this in the back of your mind, but bringing it into the limelight, specifically highlighting that, yes, this is what we will do for the scalability of the solution, that does hold its own importance there. So a bit of specifics, a bit of around the scalability, the monitoring aspect is what I will suggest you to get added to your answer, is what I will suggest. Apart from that, the generic approach, the way you understood the question and the way you handled the follow-up question, I think overall that seemed acceptable to me. And that is where I would say that if you want me to have a very high confidence in you to give you a pass, I would suggest to look into these aspects, which I highlighted just now.
I think that is the only question I have. Only other comment I would say is I found the interview process very cordial and how will I put this? I did not feel pressured in any sort of way to have to answer too quickly or too slowly. And you gave me enough time to walk through whatever solution or whatever answer I was going to give. And I was appreciative of that because I have seen some scenarios whereby there is a little tension or pressure.
Cool. Thank you for that. Most of the time, you should expect a friendly interviewer, but yes, there might be odd days. So just be ready for them also. But most of the time, you would find the interviewer to be a cordial interviewer who would be coordinating with you, kind of giving you suggestions, follow-up questions. So yeah, that would be the ideal expectations.
Yeah.
Awesome. Great talking to you, Fikayo. I think we are done. For the audience, I hope you enjoyed the question. I hope you enjoyed the session. And in case you are looking for more such preparation, more such interesting question, you know where to head. Interview Query, the platform, is your one-stop destination for all the data science, data engineer, data analyst, and all sorts of interview preparation materials, questions, and whatnot. So head over there, and I will see you in the next session.